The Glorious Revolution, de glorieuze overtocht, de roemrijke omwenteling, the Dutch invasion of Britain. Hang about, that's very vague calling the Glorious Revolution a British invasion when they were invited without much bloodshed, when it's considered a religious revolution in the UK. Do I detect some bias there? Yeah. Is it an invasion when we're invited? England has not been fully invaded since 1066, I'm afraid. I don't think there has been a successful invasion since 1066 by William. I am an American, so my knowledge may be wrong. That was just a bit of fun so that I could do a few accents here in this video. I have no idea what the people who wrote these comments sound like at all, and actually I'm really glad that they placed these comments, because this is something that you see quite a lot when talking about the Glorious Revolution, that it wasn't an invasion, it was an invitation, and so it shouldn't be counted as any kind of military exercise over to take power in a country, which is what an invasion is, and that therefore Britain has never been invaded apart from 1066 when the Normans did it. But in today's video, I'd like to express some of my views why I think the Glorious Revolution actually should be seen as an invasion, pretty much to the letter of what an invasion is. Now, to give a bit of a background about the Glorious Revolution, I'll quickly talk about what happens before and then dive into some of the points. So in 1685, James II becomes King of England. He is the king, and he already has a daughter at that point who is called Mary, and Mary marries William. William is at that point not a king himself. William is a Stadhouder, which means that he is an important figure in the Dutch Republic at the head of the government there, but he is not a king. So you may see him referred to as William of Orange, that's the House of Orange, but there have been many Williams of Orange, so another one is someone from around a century earlier, Willem de Zwijger, who is almost a founding father of the Dutch Republic. But that is a different guy, but an ancestor of this William, who is ruling in the Dutch Republic as the Stadhouder of several of the provinces there, and essentially the most powerful figure there, but he isn't a king himself. Now, the reason why this is important is that James is still king, but of course a king needs an heir, and currently that heir is a woman, Mary. So Mary is the heir to the English throne, and indeed the Scottish throne, when James dies. However, if James were to have a son, then the son would take precedence over Mary. Now, normally that wouldn't really be an issue, but this is the 17th century, which means that religion is constantly in the background. And James has been trying to push through several reforms since the start of his reign, in which he wants to get more prominent Catholics in important positions, and may in fact himself have been a closet Catholic. The worry then is that if he has a son, and the son is raised Catholic, then England will have a Catholic king, something which is incredibly unpopular, and I should say England and Scotland, because the majority of people there were Protestants. And that is the background. Okay, so reason number one why a lot of people say this wasn't an invasion is they were invited. And this is true. On the 30th of June 1688, Willem received a letter from several dignitaries, 7 in fact, who have gone down in history as the Immortal Seven, who wrote this letter to Willem asking him to militarily intervene, to use a more neutral term perhaps, in England. Now, these Immortal Seven consisted of Charles Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, who was a Tory peer. Now, the Whigs and the Tories are the two important political parties in England at this time. There's William Cavendish, the Earl of Devonshire, who was a Whig peer. There's Thomas Osborne, who was the Duke of Leeds, a Tory peer. Richard Lumley, who had been in an important position of government before, but had fallen from favour, the Earl of Scarborough. There's Henry Compton, who was the Bishop of London, of course a Protestant bishop. Edward Russell, the Earl of Orford, who had been a naval captain but had also fallen from favour and resigned his commission at that point. And Henry Sidney, the Earl of Romney, who was a former MP but actually had also gone over to the United Provinces at that point in time. Now, this is important because these figures, while they were important, aren't at the very heart of the government. Many of them had fallen from favour, and all of them obviously disagreed with many of James II's policies that were more tolerant towards Catholics, and indeed pushing towards Catholicism itself. I think the problem with claiming that this invalidates the Glorious Revolution as an invasion is that an invasion can still happen with an invitation. And indeed, the members of the Immortal Seven, none of them are inside James's close-knit circle at the very heart of the government. They were certainly important figures. However, it's not that they were on the very inside, that they had any position of actual authority to ask William to come over and intervene, rather than acting on the behalf of what they saw as the good of the country and promising support on the ground once William arrived. Now, it's true as well that there have been many invasions throughout history that had some form of invitation. One that sprang to mind immediately was in 1169, with the Norman invasion of Ireland. They were invited by a king in Ireland to come over and help him reclaim his kingdom, and we know how that went in the end. More recently as well, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has not been described in Russia as an invasion of Ukraine, but as a military intervention on behalf of the people of the Donbass. And so you see that the semantics often belie the fact that that absolutely is an invasion that has occurred. There's also a very interesting stream of events that happens in the run-up to the Glorious Revolution. In October of 1687, it's announced that James's wife, Mary of Modena, is with child, and one of the king's close counsel, Melfort, announces that it is a boy. And obviously, if this boy is born and he is a Catholic and he survives, then that means that James will have a Catholic heir, something that is inexcusable for most of the English Protestants. This is followed by, in April of 1688, that the French start to impose herring taxes and tariffs on Dutch ships, as well as promising to shore up the Royal Navy in the event of a Dutch crossing of the English Channel, something particularly prescient because the Second Anglo-Dutch Sea War had been fought in 1672 and involved the English and the French working together against the Dutch, and this is something that William greatly wanted to avoid, particularly because the French monarchy was of course very Catholic. And if James went fully Catholic, that meant there would be two large, strong Catholic powers with navies and armies on William's borders, something he definitely wanted to avoid. In April, then, the Dutch states decided to vote on whether or not to increase the size of the army and the navy, and they voted in favour, something which came through in July of 1688 when 9,000 more sailors were recruited and 21 new warships were built. However, more interesting than that for our discussion of William's possible invasion in the Glorious Revolution is that in April he met with one of the Immortal Seven. He met with Edward Russell, and it was William who asked Edward Russell for a formal invitation to rescue the nation and the faith from the Catholic threat posed by James. So if we look at a timeline of events, it seems quite clear that William is already intending to invade before he has received an invitation. Because in October of 1687, James is expecting an heir. Then in April, it's William, while speaking with Edward Russell, who requests an invitation for military intervention in England so that he can justify coming over rather than it being a blatant invasion without any justification. And then in June of 1688, William's cousin arrives in England and starts preparing the ground, seeing if people are willing to support William as king. And of course, on the last day of June, he receives that invitation from the Immortal Seven that William himself had asked for earlier. And that is when the Dutch states they levy the sailors and build the warships ready for a crossing of the English Channel and an invasion of England. So number two, and I think this is probably the crucial one, if it looks like a Dutch invasion, it probably is. Now I'm going to show you an image, a contemporary image of what the fleet looked like. And as you can see, this isn't how you would show up to a party you've been invited to. This is how you would invade a country. What's also interesting to note is that 100 years before, in 1588, the Spanish Armada, which is generally recognized as an invasion attempt, was half the size of William's fleet that came over from the Dutch Republic. It's worth noting that at this time, the Dutch state's army was made up of 30,000 men, half of whom took part in William's invasion of Britain, again suggesting this is a serious military intervention. This isn't a few people coming over with the king and sort of shifting James off the throne in a parliamentary process. This was an invasion. They even hired around 13,000 German mercenaries to shore up the Dutch border forts in fear of a French retaliation, so that they would have the men free to go over to England and to wrest control from James if they had to. And that ships that went over, the size of it, there were 15,000 soldiers and also several thousand non-combatant roles involved in that as well, and 260 transports. So this was a huge endeavour on the part of the Dutch to come over to England, and certainly a military operation. There was a lot of fear that France would retaliate, and the French had threatened to do so several times. But it was when in 1688 the French attacked Philipsburg that the Dutch knew they had their hands tied fighting against various German states, and William decided to go ahead with the invasion anyway. The big fear was that this would lead to a war between the French and the Dutch, as had happened several times before in the 17th century. But he felt shored up enough that he could take power in England with a large military force and make it back in time to stave off any French retaliation. Now, the French obviously realized the Dutch were preparing for war, and Louis sent a letter threatening the Dutch that if he did invade England, then France would invade the Dutch Republic. But William calls his bluff and continues with his military preparations. This leads to, in September, the French seizing around 100 ships. These are trading ships from Amsterdam. But this actually ends up backfiring on the French, because Willem, as I've mentioned several times, was not a king but a Stadhouder, and so he still needed the permission of the Dutch states, essentially the parliament, to actually go to war and invade another country. And so he has to get permission from the parliament to go and invade England. And because of the seizure of the ships, they see this as a sufficient reason that England is also a threat if they are working together with France, and that therefore Willem should go over and become the king in England, or well, invade England in any case. Alright, so the third point is about William's crossing of the English Channel, which is of course necessary to land all his troops in England and eventually to become king. So he actually wants to set out earlier, and he first sets out with this large invasion fleet quite late in the season on the 19th of October, but because of some terrible storms and winds, he was forced back and actually lost one of his ships in the attempted crossing, and he was forced back on the 21st of October, and they had to wait again for the wind to change so that they could actually cross over with this large force, something they finally managed to do on the 1st of November 1688. And this is crucial because the wind has changed at this point, because the English are also aware that the Dutch are up to something, and so James has made sure that his navy, under the command of the Earl of Dartmouth at that point, is monitoring the English Channel and ready to intercept any invasion fleet that is coming, because the Royal Navy was also a significant naval power at that point. But because the wind has changed, they are forced to remain at port. They can't actually get out into the English Channel to stop William's fleet from crossing over and landing his forces in Torbay in the southwest of England. And that is why there is no naval engagement to stop this invasion force, because they can't actually leave the harbour. Alright, so point number 4 is, where was the big battle? Well, as mentioned in the previous section, William is able to get his large force of men over the channel and landed without having to fight a naval engagement against James. Now, what really is a problem for James is how unpopular he is as king. The army was very largely Protestant and anti-Catholic at that point, and so loyalty was already pretty frayed in the armed forces in England at this point. Now, William, of course, has a huge force, and James does want to prepare to go out and meet it. However, what happens in the end are that there are only a few engagements that are fought. There is one at Wincanton where fewer than 20 men are killed, and another one at Reading where again it's very small numbers that are involved here. There are several reasons why we don't see a large battle in the Glorious Revolution. One is that William has carefully chosen his landing point of Torbay, which is quite far away from London on the south coast, because he knows through his spy networks that he's had operating in England that James is really rather unpopular, and so he hopes that by sort of landing far away from where the majority of the royalist forces are, the government will collapse in on itself, and that he might even get local support for his plans to take over the government. Now, he also says at this point that he is not interested in becoming the King of England, although whether this is actually the case or not is somewhat debatable. He rather says that he is simply there to secure his wife, which is of course James's daughter, to secure her inheritance from what he sees as a Catholic threat in the form of James's new heir. And indeed, as William had thought, James's government, even though he manages to get an army of some 20,000 together, he doubts the loyalty of the commanders and the men, and he decides instead to flee away to France. Now, he tries to do this on the 11th of December, but he is then captured by local fishermen and shepherded back to London. However, on the 18th, William does actually make it to London, and he meets with James, and James is actually relocated to Ham, precisely because William knows that it's very easy to escape from there, so that he will not have to deal with having a king in captivity. And indeed, on the 23rd of December, James is allowed to escape to France, which he then does to the court of Louis. However, this isn't the end of the story, because he starts preparing to come back. Now, in the meantime, there is a whole parliamentary process about whether William can be made king, and indeed that Mary, of course, is the heir of James, and so Mary becomes the queen and then rules as a co-monarch with William. That's one of her stipulations, is that William will rule as a co-monarch. But essentially, this means that the English and the Dutch are now together in a fast alliance against the French, which, as we've seen from William's request for invitation, was what he wanted to achieve all along. So William has got what he wanted out of this. And there is no large battle in 1688, but in 1689 various rebellions at the corners of his new kingdom break out, and this is in Scotland and in Ireland. And indeed, James comes back into Ireland, and in 1690 a huge battle is fought as a result of the Glorious Revolution, and that is at the Battle of the Boyne, and it involves some 40,000 men, with James coming over with French troops and with Irish troops that were loyal to him, and indeed other English troops that had remained loyal to James, and William commanding his Dutch soldiers, veterans from the continent, and indeed now the English army that had largely defected to William following James's flight from the country. And it's as a result of William's victory at the Battle of the Boyne that he secures his position as the new King of England, and indeed will stay that way. And of course, that's a hugely significant moment in history, particularly for Ireland and Northern Ireland, but also I think for the other kingdoms in the United Kingdom, given all the things that William changed and added in terms of his constitutional monarchy and the role of Parliament and all these things. So a final point is that history is written by the victors, and in this case William won. He became the co-ruling king of England after this revolution, and so it became known as the Glorious Revolution. And indeed, just as we're seeing today with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are certain political advantages for not describing yourself as having invaded another country, but rather being invited there. And that seems to be the case with William. And as we see from his communications, he is himself the biggest proponent that this was not an invasion. However, his actions speak louder than his words. And with such a large fleet and a large army that had landed in a strategic position that was part of a wider geopolitical struggle against the French to secure Britain as an ally of the Dutch Republic, to me this is really, in every other word, an invasion. Even though it did not result in a large-scale battle immediately, that battle would be fought 2 years later in Ireland against James and his supporters, and it was rather because of James's weak government and the loyalty that had gone against him of his own men as a result of his policies that this invasion was rather easy for William to pull off, but it remains an invasion nonetheless. A final factor that I think is very important for why William and obviously the Immortal Seven and others that remained in positions of power in England, why they didn't want this to be an invasion, and possibly also why William is so happy for James to leave of his own accord and not to keep him in captivity or execute him, is because of the events that had happened following the English Civil War, following the execution of an English king, Charles I, in 1649. And this is because they had very much, the parliamentarians had very much done this out in the open. They had put a king to trial, found him guilty, and executed him out in the open. However, in 1660, when Charles I's son, Charles II, comes to the throne, everyone was pardoned, apart from those that had given the sentence to the king, and they were hounded across England. Many of them fled to the New World and to Europe, and many of them were either assassinated or brought to trial or spent the rest of their lives in prison. They were followed without mercy by Charles II's agents, and I think this example would be fresh in people's minds, that it's very important of how you sell things, and that if you actively go against a king, if the wind changes, then you will indeed be in a very poor position. It's also worth wondering how things would have been if William had been unsuccessful. It almost certainly would not then be called the Glorious Revolution, and quite possibly would be branded as a failed Dutch invasion of Britain. But I think because it was successful, that it had to be branded as the Glorious Revolution rather than that time when the Dutch came over and invaded Britain. Of course, it was more complex, and James was not a popular king, and as we saw from the events of the late 1688, that many in England were more than happy to defect over to William once he had arrived. However, I don't think that detracts from the fact that with a fleet of over 260 transport ships and many warships, 15,000 men, that is an invasion, and William was, in fact, successful. But anyway, let me know in the comments below, what do you think? Do you stick to the idea that Britain has only been invaded in 1066 and that the Glorious Revolution is just a revolution and shouldn't count and is an internal English thing? Or do you think that 15,000 Dutch soldiers coming over may have persuaded a few people that it was the best thing to go with it? Well, you're welcome, of course, to agree or disagree in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing people's opinions. So thank you all very much for watching this video on the Glorious Revolution, the roemrijke omwenteling, as it is sometimes called in quite flowery Dutch. I hope to see you all again very soon for another video, and until then, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.